Um, so we're going to do a presentation for about 40 minutes, and then we're going to have some time for questions at the end. So as we're going along, if you want to put any questions or just comments that you'd like to share with the group, into the Q&A function, we'll return to those at the end. Should we go on to the next slide? So a little bit about the Solidarity Knows No Borders community. So this project, it was really born out of the SKMB community, and that is a sort of network of groups and individuals who are all working together and we sort of all doing a very diverse range of jobs and expertise in the community, and we all come together to organise, strategise and work together in sort of solidarity and for migrant justice, and really our shared goals are around freedom, justice and dignity for all. So yeah, this is born out of the SKMB community. And so a little bit about Stand Up, Speak Out. So I think it started because thinking about that community, and just like more broadly, the amount of expertise and knowledge in this kind of NGO world and activist world, and thinking of a way that we can share that and bridge the gap between what happens over here in this sector and what's happening in the public sector, and bring those two worlds together and share that knowledge, because we believe that knowledge and education is such a powerful tool for social change, and that we all have a role to play in different sectors in this struggle for justice and freedom, equality and human dignity for everybody. So that's really what SUSO is trying to do. It's trying to bring together these different worlds and share knowledge and education. Last year was our first year, and it was really successful. I think we're really proud of that. And there were over 1,000 people who attended training and came to the various different sessions, and over 20 workshops and lots of amazing expertise. And we're really happy to be doing it all over again this year. So yeah, if you're a doctor, teacher, social worker, advocate, charity worker, this is for you. So to introduce, I'll introduce myself first, and then Brian and Ali can introduce themselves. My name is Naomi, and I'm the Managing Director at Social Workers Without Borders. And Social Workers Without Borders is a charity that started in 2016 after, in quite an ad hoc way, really, just of a group of social workers coming together after volunteering in northern France and in Greece. But it was in northern France that we started doing best interests assessments and using assessments and that social work expertise to provide expert evidence for people in immigration and asylum law. And so that's what we do now. And we also do a bit of campaigning and education.
Everyone, I'm Brian. So I'm the legal organizer at Migrants Organise. We're a charity based in London. We have the community program where we offer ongoing and holistic support for migrants and asylum seekers. So we're an OIS Level 3 advice service. I'm an OIS Level 3 advisor as well. And on top of that, we do community organizing and campaign and strategic legal work around different issues around the hostile environment.
And I'm Ali. I'm a young person's development worker at PAFRAS. We're a really small organisation based in Leeds. We started in 2003, and our then director was just handing out food parcels from the boot of her car, and we've kind of developed into an organisation that we are now. So we work primarily with people who are destitute or risk of destitution, and like in a really wide range of ways. That's through crisis intervention, casework, the specialist project that I work on, which is Young Migrants Matter, mental health support, and then obviously there's like the advocacy, activism and leadership. And me, Naomi and Brian all met through the SKMB network, so you can see like how amazing the network is. And yeah, we're kind of like the organising committee of SUSO, and we do that alongside some of the young people that I work with, who've been really instrumental in putting this series together and promoting it, and yeah, really grateful to them. And they'll be delivering a session as well during the series. I think it's me. So I imagine most people know what the hostile environment is, but we thought it'd be really good to introduce you to it in this launch session, and really recommend going back and looking on the SUSO YouTube. Maybe someone can put a link in the chat. Lucy Mablin did a fantastic seminar last year that was recorded around like the roots of like colonialism and hostile environment today. So I really recommend looking at that. But I'll give you a brief history. Before we kind of go into this, I think it's important to think about how, or as we move forward, to understand how nationality and the concept of nationality really ties in strongly with immigration law. I guess if we understand immigration law as, in really basic terms, like the control of people who aren't citizens of a country. So being a citizen, being a national, means that you aren't subject to immigration control. So the idea you can take that away from somebody is really important, and we'll see that as we go through this very brief history. So we can see that the beginning of immigration law as we know it today, it roots in exclusion, discrimination, and was at the time in the 1905 Aliens Act targeted around denying entry to undesirable immigrants. And we can see that this rhetoric hasn't really changed. So yeah, it was vaguely worded, but really it was levied at Jewish and Eastern European immigrants. Then we'll skip forward to 1951 Refugee Convention, which people are talking about a lot now in relation to the Illegal Migration Act and saying that we're turning our back on this convention. Even this convention is rooted in racism. It prevented non-Europeans from being considered as refugees until the 1967 protocol, and kind of made reference there in the slides to sort of other mass migration movements that were outside of Europe happening at the time. So yeah, the partition of India and Pakistan, Palestine, the Korean War, etc. So post-World War, Britain needs to fill out public sector shortages. They ask people from Commonwealth countries to come and fill these roles and support the country, and in return they will be citizens. The government did not like the fact that this was mostly Black and Asian people coming from Commonwealth countries, and then we see the 1962 and 1968 Commonwealth Immigration Acts. There are lots of incredibly racist quotes that you can find around this, but essentially it was found by the European Court of Human Rights to be racially discriminatory and violating of Article 3 of human rights. So yeah, and these are the kind of the groundworks for the Windrush scandal. 1971 Immigration Act. This is really the foundation of all immigration control. You will still hear immigration enforcement officers referring to this act. It's still very relevant, and this is really the first time that the introduction of criminalisation of migration, and then from there we see this further developing. So like I said, the idea of nationality is really important and links in with this, and the 1981 British Nationality Act introduces the idea of depriving someone of citizenship, and that means making them subject to immigration control. We've just put in a few things around like Labour and Conservatives, like, no, we're not partisan, but I think it's really important to highlight that both political parties have been have introduced things that are incredibly discriminatory and cruel towards migrants, and you can see that in the 1999 Immigration and Asylum Act, which first introduced the idea of the National Asylum Support Service and segregated asylum seekers from the alternative into an alternative welfare provision. Yeah, obviously post 9/11, we start to see again this increase on the idea of being able to deprive someone of citizenship, more Islamophobia, further racism. And again, you can see here the increase in fines and custodial sentences for employers who are employing people without the correct leave and conditions on their leave. So again, this is under Labour government. The Tories have been horrendous. Yeah. And then obviously, really infamously in 2012, Theresa May announces her plans for the hostile environment. We've kind of already seen this developing over time, but this is really like the crux of what we're talking about today. So This is mostly enforced through the Immigration Acts 2014 and 2016. And as we go through this presentation, we'll really break down the ways in which the hostile environment plays out within each of these areas. What I felt important to highlight was that in between these two acts, which essentially block people from accessing really key public services, we've got the Modern Slavery Act, which feels like a really cruel joke, because if you're blocking people from essential services where they need to, these things that keep people safe, and you're pushing them into exploitation, and you're pushing people into situations where they don't have a safety net, this is how modern slavery occurs. And yet we've got an act here that's focusing really around like the government's the savior. And yeah, I think if you read Emily Kenway, The Truth About Modern Slavery, she explains it really well. Then yeah, obviously 2017, the Windrush scandal happens, and this is really a direct result of the hostile environment. And then again, obviously 2022 and 2023 have been horrendous. The Rwanda bill is in House of Lords today. And yeah, another iteration of racialized state violence. So yeah, we've already mentioned this, but yeah, really famously, Theresa May said the aim is to create here in Britain a really hostile environment for illegal immigrants. There is no such thing as an illegal immigrant. I'd hope that everyone knows that here. Some people fall foul of immigration rules, and they change all the time. And we can see that like in the history that I've just shown. But what she really means is making life as intolerable as possible for human beings who are unlawfully resident, by cutting them off from the necessities of life and preventing access to public services. So I mentioned Lucy Maitland, but another thing that's really worth reading is this essay around everyday bordering. But essentially it's the idea that borders no longer exist at the edge of territories, but these policies, so all the things we just discussed, really put borders into banks and schools and universities and hospitals and on public transport. Like, borders are everywhere, and they outsource the responsibility of immigration enforcement and control onto the public. And we also really want to acknowledge that, like, for people working in public sector services, people go into these things often wanting to help, and suddenly they're being made to be complicit and act like border guards. So we've got like a list of examples here. So renting accommodation, getting a job, getting married, opening a bank account, accessing healthcare, and we'll talk more in detail as we go along. Really famously, Byron Burgess in 2016 told staff to come in for an early morning meeting, and they were met with immigration enforcement. SOAS did something similar in 2009. In 2019 or 2020, I want to say, there was a organisation who was advertising for immigration advice for people who are undocumented, and they were actually sharing this information with the Home Office. So yeah, it's really bleak, and part of the point of this series is like we don't want people to be complicit, because these systems only work if we allow them to. This is a quote from Fatima, who couldn't be here today, unfortunately, but she is really instrumental in creating this series, and she'll be delivering a session in June, but you'll have to listen to me read it instead. So Fatima writes, "Being undocumented in the UK is absolute hell. It's literally like being stuck. You can't do nothing. You can't even go to the club with your friends on a night out, as you need an ID, which I don't have. I can't open a bank account, so I need cash for everything. With the world evolving, cash usage is falling at unprecedented rates in economies across the world. I always have a fear of being stopped or detained, as I am illegally here. Seeing your friends that you started school with, going to university, getting jobs, and just moving on with their lives while you still don't know what the future holds for you can be quite depressing, as it honestly messes up with your mental health. I have no control over my life or my future, which is not right. I should be able to make decisions on what I want to do with my life. I yearn to have a normal teenage life, like going to university, traveling with friends, and not worrying about how I am going to survive for the rest of the week with no money. I shouldn't be worrying about if I'm still going to be living like this in the next few years. I shouldn't be worried if I'm going to be homeless or even deported. I do not have the privilege of being born in a safe, free, and democratic country. I came here to be protected, yet the system is completely dehumanizing us. they don't consider us as deserving of the same human rights and protections of others. So Fatima is only 20. And I think like we talk a lot about, well, the really important basic essential living needs, but also for me working with young people, it is just like people can't be young and can't be like their peers, and it's just like repeated isolation and segregation just in trying to do everyday life things. As Fatima mentioned, with talking about cashless world, like things are becoming more digital. I'm sure if anyone's worked with anyone who has a share code for the EUSS scheme, it's a nightmare. It's really hard to use. We know through COVID like how difficult it was with people accessing things digitally, and it's really concerning the way in which the Home Office is operating with a lack of transparency, safeguards, and accountability. The idea that you can switch someone's status on and off is really worrying. And then obviously we're seeing the use of GPS tagging, and yeah, recommend this report, Every Move You Make, which kind of really looks at the cost of tagging humans essentially. And yeah, if the Home Office's data collection is going to be the really important thing, you know, they're asking organisations to share data, they are making all these decisions based on data, yet they can't even manage it effectively. And you can see here like they've been repeatedly criticised for extremely poor data collection practices. Data, the lifeblood of decision making, is inexcusably awful. Same year, there were issues of poor record keeping and incomplete or inaccurate data. And then literally an article came out a couple of days ago with leaked documents that showed, errors hit more than 76,000 people. These practices can and do have really devastating consequences and continue to do so. Things haven't changed. We just wanted to highlight another kind of part of the hostile environment is no recourse public funds. I believe we might have some recorded from last year, but the others might know better than me. But yeah, it's an immigration condition that isn't just for people seeking asylum. And again, this is another way of preventing people from accessing key services. Yeah. And obviously, if you ask the general public to behave like border control and border guards, it's probably going to be racist. The Home Office themselves admitted in February of last year, sorry, that hostile environment policies disproportionately affect Black and Asian people. Countless examples of the ways in which hostile environment policies are discriminatory and racist. And you can see here, right to rent scheme ruled incompatible with human rights law, migrants in England denied NHS care for average of 37 weeks, how long it takes to find a job. I think something that really highlights the poor data collection as well is this example up here of non-verbal Black teenager who was never left UK detained at immigration centre. This links to the stop and scan process, and there's a whole session about this in April with Racial Justice Network. So it was trialled by West Yorkshire Police, but it's been rolled out to quite a lot of other police forces in the country. All police officers carry biometric mobile fingerprint scanners. What some police forces can now do is connect it with an immigration database. So essentially this happened to this this teenager who left the hospital. He's pricked up by British Transport Police, fingerprinted, linked to the database, and then the data was incorrect and he was taken to immigration detention. So really clear and awful example of racist hostile environment, racist policing, stop and scan process, poor data collection, the list goes on. So this is my last bit, but I think, so we're going to break down in the different ways in which the hostile environment plays out and kind of give examples of why being equipped with the right knowledge can be really helpful. So We've got 2 sessions, like I said, there's Stop the Scan around resisting police overreach, and that's in April. And then again in April, Leeds Anti-Raids will be giving a really practical workshop about resisting immigration raids. And I think this quote like sums up really, really well. One shopkeeper closing their doors and denying entries to ICE, to immigration compliance enforcement teams, takes a lot less energy than several hundred people spending a day in the streets, and often achieves the same results. It still offers a place for community opposition to build and sends a clear message to the Home Office, but can often happen before anyone is at immediate risk of being detained. So this kind of know your rights, like really, like we said, knowledge is power. This is so essential. It's so preventative. It's really proactive and not just reactive, which I think a lot of us like feel in these sectors that we're always reacting to things and firefighting. So yeah, engaging with SUSO is a really great way of being proactive as well. And you know, like hostile environment playing out in the streets and policing and immigration enforcement, this is like a real clear example of racism. And yeah, as it says here, immigration raids are often based off low-grade tip-offs without a court warrant and on the basis of informed consent, and they don't have to record whether or not informed consent is used. So again, like impunity, poor data collection, the list goes on. So yeah, check out those workshops for that, and I will pass over.
The section that I'm now going to have a focus on is around social work, social care, and this really, so I'm a social worker by background, and Social Workers Without Borders are a sort of national network of social workers. And one of the things that really drives us and brings us together is how incompatible and untenable for our professional ethics and what we feel our professional identity and what we think social work should be, when as social workers we are frequently tasked with enforcing these hostile immigration and asylum processes, and that's just not aligned to what we think that this job should be about. So that's one of the aspects, it's one of the real aspects of the glue that brings us together as a social work community. So yeah, some of the ways that for us as social workers that we are expected to be complicit with the hostile environment. We're going to just give some examples of that. So there is so Ali touched on like the no recourse to public funds condition and how that locks people out of welfare entitlement. So for lots of families with insecure immigration status, the only safety net that they have is the Section 17 support under the Children Act as for child and need support. But unfortunately, when people try to access that support through their local authorities, frequently social workers are acting like gatekeepers. They are not accurately sharing information about people's entitlement under that piece of the law, and working in quite threatening and coercive ways. I've certainly on the other side, not as a social worker, but supporting someone through social service support, work with people who've had their children removed from their care, and through that kind of battle to be reunited through the court process, or because of their immigration status and denial of adequate support under Section 17. And so what we know about no recourse to public funds is that it makes the families and the children and the people that we're working with less safe. So you know, it's a frequently a feature in serious case reviews, and it elevates the risk around domestic abuse, the impact of poverty, instability, social isolation. So what we've tried to do in the SUSO program is think about there's some really good sessions on how, so we've got one on domestic abuse, thinking about housing, healthcare for migrant women, and we've got one on social work education and how what social workers need in their education to become allies for people with insecure immigration status. So if there's any social workers on this call, do come to those sessions definitely, so you can learn about and think about how you can work in this system so you're actually keeping people safe rather than just assessing their immigration status and acting as a gatekeeper. Should we go on to the next slide? Yeah, so more on like a focus, and you'll see on the recommended sessions that these are a focus on like social work and practice with young people, children and young people. And definitely at Social Workers Without Borders, a lot of the work that we do is thinking about social work. Social workers work a lot with unaccompanied children, and so we've got just a note on here around age assessment, although we don't actually have a session this year about age assessment. We did have one last year, but just it's such a stark illustration of social workers being asked to do these quite immigration focused tasks and deciding whether someone seeking asylum is a child or not. This is a really imprecise process, and the recent legislative changes have really increased the risk of children wrongly being treated as adults. And age assessment, it has become something that's really weaponized and has become a hostile immigration process. And this is really notable through the creation of the National Age Assessment Board, whereby the Home Office has employed their own social workers under their directorate and have made that a very immigration rather than a safeguarding focused job of social workers. But yeah, there's lots of different ways that unaccompanied children are treated unequally to their sort of British citizen peers who are in care. There's a workshop here around ECPAT's legal challenge on the accommodation of unaccompanied children who were being housed in hotels and outside the protection of the Children Act. There is a workshop on contextual safeguarding with unaccompanied young people, a workshop from SLRA around identifying the immigration needs of children in care, and another one from Kind UK around identifying immigration and citizenship routes for children who have insecure immigration status but aren't asylum seekers. And then there's a workshop from Young Migrants Matter, who can sort of tell you from their perspective about their experiences of being unaccompanied children and access to services. And there's a quote here from one of the young ambassadors, just talking about why this is so important for social workers to have this knowledge. So she said, "This seminar series could change someone's life. As an asylum seeker, I always wondered what would have happened if I wasn't failed by the system. What could have happened if I was asked the right questions by my social worker and action was taken to help me before I turned 18 with my status? This seminar series is a very powerful, personal to me, as it gives me the opportunity to let people in power gain more understanding on how to help young asylum seekers. Our voices, our stories deserve to be heard and understood by those with the ability to enact change, in the hopes that our needs are met with compassion and action, and my hope for a world where the right actions lead to brighter outcomes for all." That's just a really powerful quote about why social workers should upskill and educate themselves, which described it much better than my introduction did. So yeah, next slide. And yeah, just so we talked a bit about families, we talked about unaccompanied children, but also in adults in social care, and human rights assessments, which has always just really baffled me how social workers are expected to do this task. So under Schedule 3 of the Nationality, Immigration and Asylum Act, which excludes some people from local authority support. So the human rights assessment is like a secondary process to a Care Act assessment, whereby social workers will do a Care Act assessment, decide if someone has care and support needs, but then have to do another assessment to decide if it's safe for a person, or if they should remain here in the UK, or if it's safe for them to return to their country of origin and therefore be denied services, which seems completely outside the remit of the social work role. But it is a type of assessment that social workers are asked to do. And so there's this really interesting webinar. I'm really looking forward to this one. I'm looking forward to all of them, but I feel like I'm going to learn a lot from this one about disabled asylum seekers and Care Act assessments, and who are asylum seekers, and so what's the role of the local authority and what's the role of asylum support. So I think that'll be a really good webinar for anyone working in adult social care. And Brian's just put this a case study of why it's so important for social workers to have this knowledge, because Brian does some brilliant work working with migrants around their capacity, mental capacity. In this case study, ST was an asylum seeker with delusional disorder. She hoards, she would eat from rubbish bins, and she's at high risk of self-neglect. She's been sectioned under the Mental Health Act multiple times. She was living in an asylum support hotel, which was completely unsuitable. Multiple safeguarding concerns were raised, and the Home Office referred her to ACS NRPF team. Shortly afterwards, she was sectioned again as her condition deteriorated, and her NHS care coordinator redid her Care Act assessment and found her to have eligible needs and advocated for her with the funding panel. She was provided suitable accommodation, which allowed her to engage with the immigration process, and she's now been granted status. So it's a really good example of how public sector workers can intervene, and different workers will do different assessments, and it's really important to think what's going on there for you, what's your window on the world, how's that informing your assessment, because it has such life-changing outcomes for people. Okay, next slide. Yes, you, Brian.
Thanks so much, Naomi. Yeah, so the hostile empowerment obviously has kind of impact in other areas as well. So if we're talking about housing and benefits, for example, at the moment, the National Asylum Support System is the kind of main system that exists for asylum seekers who are destitute and who can't find accommodation or subsistence, which is obviously it's no surprise, because individuals that are asylum seekers are not allowed to get any public benefits, for example, and it's also a criminal offense for them to work. It's on the news all the time because the asylum system, support system is obviously not working for everyone. For the individuals in the asylum system themselves, I've put there a photo of an example of an asylum support accommodation room, for example. Of course, this is quite like a stark example. But if you see in the news, for example, all the hotels that people are accommodated in, they're really run down as well. They're overstuffed with a lot of individuals, overcrowded, and now the government has started increasingly using mass accommodation / detention sites as well, like the Bibi Barge, Napier, Wethersfield, where the conditions are so terrible that a lot of individuals actually very sadly committed suicide as a result, for example. And it is costing the taxpayers a lot of money as well. I think there was a report published just today by the National Audit Office, which says that the cost of all these detention sites, which the government said is being used because the hotels are so expensive, it's actually more expensive than the hotel. So money's not being saved. Individuals are really struggling and living in terrible conditions. And it is, I think, really kind of highlights the aim of the hostile environment, which is, as you know, from the very beginning, Theresa May has said, is to create a really hostile environment for migrants, and they are, you know, doing very well with that aim in mind. And yeah, and as I said, with the NRPF conditions, asylum seekers and migrants and individuals with status with no recourse to public fund are unable to access welfare benefits, which obviously usually acts a lot as a safeguard for individuals, especially in a cost of living crisis that we're in. It also makes it difficult for a lot of asylum seekers who get status eventually as refugees, for example, and can claim benefits. There are also a lot of issues that they face in that transition period between being in asylum support system and transitioning to kind of mainstream benefit, which is why my colleagues actually in June are going to kind of provide some seminars on that, on post-status benefits for migrants and refugees, how to apply for the universal credit or PIP and child benefits, for example, because there are issues with identity documents, for example. A lot of refugees only have the biometric residence permit card and don't have passport or regular IDs, which means that a lot of job centers, kind of work coaches, for example, question the identity and ask a lot of questions, which they don't usually ask for other individuals. And the same issue goes for housing, for example. So there was kind of a big news, like, you know, big issue last year about the Home Office changing their operations and asking migrants to leave their, only giving like 7 days notice for migrants to leave their asylum support accommodation in order to find another alternative accommodation once they're granted status, or seek help from the housing team at the council. Obviously, this puts a lot of pressures on the council, and a lot of migrants and asylum seekers and refugees as a result ended up on the street. Yeah, and with the right to rent checks, for example, all landlords are required to check people's immigration status, which again then goes back to all the kind of racist not undertone actually, the racism that Ali mentioned. A lot of people from minority background are, you know, more, it becomes more difficult for them to find rented accommodations, even if they have the right status, for example, because just by the very fact that they will be asked and required to provide these identities and show their immigration status. So we've got a really good lineup around these issues. So if you're working as in the council, for example, or you're assisting people around housing, Suluk is going to deliver a session on housing in a hostile environment next week. There's also an overview of entitlement or support, including housing, in March. And asylum support appeals project is going to deliver a session on asylum support, and it's going to kind of cover the basic of asylum support, who gets it, how to get it, and that sort of thing. And Positive Action is actually going to share as well the experiences of asylum seekers in asylum support accommodation, so you can hear more directly from them. Yeah. Likewise, healthcare is equally, obviously the hostile environment is also there, unfortunately, largely in the form of the NHS overseas charging regulations, which kind of require our doctors and nurses to essentially check people's immigration status before they offer care and treatment. A lot of people are charged as a result. So we at Migrants Organise, for example, we're working with someone who was charged £96,000 because he suffered a stroke and had to receive treatment from the Home Office. And there's also kind of this chilling effect when it comes to kind of public services, which obviously affect public health. So, for example, because of this charging regulations, for example, a lot of migrants and asylum seekers weren't really sure whether they were able to get vaccinations during COVID. There was a lot of fear in the communities that we work with around this issue. And obviously this became like a public health problem as well, because with things like COVID, if a certain group of individuals in the community is not getting vaccinated, then everyone will suffer the harm. But it's not very surprising given how the hostile environment also permeates the NHS services, with GP surgeries, for example, also often denying people from registering with their service because they don't have the right kind of ID, even though this is not actually a requirement. Everyone can register with GP surgeries, and all primary care services are free. And I work quite a lot with the NHS mental health services, for example, and I know there's often a lot of difficulties in discharging patients from hospital because of the lack of options that are available for individuals. Again, Naomi spoke about the difficulties with social services providing support through Care Act or Section 17, asylum support often being unsuitable for individuals. They're at risk of being dispersed from their community where they have support, and even being put in the barge or other mass detention sites. Yeah, an example of how knowledge can be useful. So for example, I think a lot of professionals don't realize that Section 117 aftercare support under the Mental Health Act is actually not an excluded provision under Schedule 3, the one that Naomi spoke about. So unlike with Care Act, for example, you don't have to do a human rights assessment, and everyone can be eligible for it, regardless of the immigration status, as long as they fulfill the main criteria, which is, for example, they've been sectioned under Section 3 of the Mental Health Act. But yeah, a lot of some professionals that I've worked with, they didn't realize that this was the case, for example, and didn't know that this was an option to assist the people they're working with. Yeah, so we've got quite a few seminars on NHS charging, which I would really recommend. The one on maternity care is going to provide one focusing on maternity care, but the Patient Not Passport campaign is also going to kind of give a broader overview of the NHS charging regulations. Access to justice is another area where there's a lot of difficulties for migrants and asylum seekers. There's currently a crisis in immigration legal aid. The last estimate was 50% of asylum seekers are unable to obtain legal aid representations and advice at the moment. And I think that is quite an optimistic estimate, I would say. And that's not even counting other migrants, other human rights migrants, victim of trafficking, for example, who also require legal aid representations and advice, but don't technically count as an asylum seekers. As a result, many individuals don't really know their rights, and immigration law is really complex, especially because of this kind of intricate network and connections between immigration legislations and things like the Care Act, for example, and other kind of social welfare legislations. And obviously this is much more difficult if someone has, added vulnerabilities and additional needs, such as domestic abuse victims, people with mental health issues, and other disabilities. So yeah, and again, we've listed a few sessions which would be useful. I think the Right to Remain, for example, is delivering one on their toolkit. They've got like a really fantastic toolkit for individuals and people in the community to understand a bit more about the immigration system and to know their rights. They're going to talk about how to use their toolkit most efficiently. Yeah, and I think we've mentioned the other ones as well. Yeah, and lastly, we just want to highlight a few sessions which are a bit more kind of give a broader overview about how the hostile environment is it's not an isolated system. It's all connected, and all of our struggles are actually like really connected with one another, basically. Ali has touched on it as well in terms of how this kind of all links up to racism and fascism and all these different things, all these social issues that we're all facing together. And it's important for us to kind of actually come together and build those connections and relationship, and not make this migrant movement kind of movement for justice for everyone and not just for migrants. So my colleagues are going to do some introductions to organizing on Friday. We're also going to hear from Climate Justice Coalition about the intersection between climate justice and migrant justice. And lastly, Claiming Space is actually going to do a session on vicarious trauma, burnout, and collective care. Again, we've heard there's so many issues under the hostile environment, and it's a big piece of work that we're embarking on, and it's really important for us to kind of care for one another, check in with ourselves. So please sign up. It's all free. It's all there on the website, and please share it as much as possible, as far and widely as possible, to all of your network, friends, colleagues, families, and everyone else.